What's a good ratio of fat to muscle gained on a natural bulk? And would this ratio be expected to remain the same for someone in their 40s when it seems as though body fat is even easier to acquire over muscle?
So two things to consider. One, so individual to the point where it's very difficult to answer that question on what a good ratio is. I think a better perspective is that you set up all of the various things that will optimize that process, and then it is what it is, and then you calibrate from there. If you tried to be on the little higher end of the rate that we'll discuss that is appropriate, and it was mostly fat, or likewise, if you kept it really, really like, I'm just going to go kind of the gaintaining approach, and I only gained 1 pound every 3 months or something like that, and it was all muscle, but I don't know if that was unnecessarily slow, then you could try a little faster next time. That's ultimately what it's going to be, because you don't know what your muscular potential is. There are so many variables related to your training primarily that can make that process effective. We often say nutrition is permissive to muscle mass gains, and the main thing that's going to stimulate it is your training. So if you have a fantastically set up training program and then you step in with good nutrition, it'll go very well. But if your training program, regardless of what you do with your nutrition, is not great, then fixing your nutrition will do nothing, because it's not the problem, right? So that's caveat one. Caveat two, if you've been training since you were 20, yeah, it'll be harder to put on muscle without it being more fat when you're 40, but it's actually not because you're 40. It's because you've been training for 20 years. When we just purely look at differences between people who are 40 and younger, especially in active people, we really see very little difference, if at all. In fact, there is data when you correct for activity levels and health that show that testosterone levels don't even decline in men in their 40s and 50s. More importantly, though, does testosterone in the physiological range explain the gains you make? And the answer is they don't. They might have some impact on the baseline level of muscle mass you have, but when you actually look at explaining how much change occurs, they don't. And anyone who's incredulous about that, think about women. They have far lower testosterone levels than men, yet they get the same relative increase in muscle mass when they start on a program. And this has been demonstrated in very large sample sizes. Classic study by Hubble in 2005 that you put people on this 12-week program across a variety of ages, both sexes, 12 weeks doing bicep curls, and you get 0 to 60% increase. Poor bastard, and who got 0%. Awesome person who got 60% increase in their muscle cross-sectional area, and that was true regardless of sex. So the difference between a biological male, biological female is going to be their baseline starting, because they went through different puberties. And that it's not until you actually do super physiological levels of testosterone, like you might see in someone going through a transition to getting to the other sex, or in someone who's taking a performance enhancing level usage of a super physiological testosterone. So yeah, I think for one, the narrative around age, it's only going to be true if it's co-varying with a narrative around experience. Like, I'm gaining less muscle now, not because I'm 40, but because I've been training for 19 years. So those are the two things I would say. Brian, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think rather than like the ratio, because we're never going to know the ratio specifically anyway, so I think looking at it more in terms of like rate of gain, depending on your training experience. And, Eric, I know in like the nutrition pyramid books, like 0.5 to 1.5 or 0.25 to 1.5% per month, and there's
Yep.
going to be, so like if you're a novice, you're going to be able to get away with a larger surplus and a faster rate of gain, while if you take that same surplus and put it, apply it to a lifter who's been training for 30 years, they're going to gain a lot more body fat. So I think just having that concept, I think, helps a lot. But I also see people that, just to kind of support your point with the individuality of it, where like there's nothing inherently special about these percentages. Like this is just the concept that we're trying to illustrate here. And as an example, I have an athlete who is, I would say, probably early to middle intermediate in terms of training age. And, you know, when we first started working together, we put him on a surplus aiming to gain around like 1% per month, you know, on average. And when I say that, it's like compare last month's weigh-in average to the next month's, you know, because there's going to be variability within that, you know, on a day-to-day basis sometimes. So, but what I found, like looking at the data after the first like 6 weeks or so, was like, okay, our rate is exceeding what we want. I think we like are probably a little bit too aggressive here. And then I had him like send some photos, or the next time we had a call, he'd updated some photos, and it was very clear, like he's like, it would have been foolish for me to pull back on the deficit before, or on the surplus before seeing the photos, because he was closer to about 2% per month, but was just as lean as he was when he started. So
Nice.
it's gotta, don't look at the quantitative data shouldn't trump the qualitative aspect of things. Like if you're seeing results in the mirror that you're happy with, performance is going up, then like you're probably in a good spot.
Yeah. And for the listeners, for reference, the percentages that they're talking about are percent of body weight change.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Good point.
And those roughly correlate to being in a 10 to 20% energy surplus. Like if you take your current calories and maintenance and you increase them by 10 to 20%, that's kind of what we're talking about. So if you're eating 2,000 calories, you're going up to 2,200 to 2,400 is a decent guideline. With a slower one being closer to 10%, faster one being closer to 20%. It's not always going to be perfect because it has more to do with how much absolute muscle tissue you can accrue, but
right.
It's a decent rule of thumb.
The earlier you are in your training career, the higher percent change you can see without it necessarily being fat. So if, so like Brian said, like a 0.25 to like 1 or 1.2% body weight change per month is what you said at the beginning, right? And that, if you are a beginner, it's okay to be kind of towards the top end of that. But if you're advanced, closer to the bottom, if at all, looking more at maybe over 6 months or a year, seeing tiny changes. Or I think we've even said like none at all. It's just solely qualitative, how you're feeling, how you're looking when you're very advanced.
And
that's regardless of age, like you were saying. In regards to this.
Yeah, I mean, there is a point when age does matter, but because of the person asking this question is in their 40s, I would just say like, hey, age would not be the factor I'd be considering until maybe you're in your 50s or later for most people. And then just being a little more conservative. But a novice who starts lifting weights at 50 will absolutely gain muscle mass, you know?
Yeah.
So the qualitative experience of bulking, if I could summarize this, if you're in a category of I have like decent genetics compared to the average people of people who lift, which is probably better than average genetics because a lot of people have terrible genetics to stop. Let's be honest. Or better is that when I'm a novice and I did my first reasonable bulk, or my aggressive bulk, at least in the very beginning, I looked better as I was doing it. And then once you're like an intermediate or later, unless you've just got great genetics, the experience is all the way from I'm looking better in some ways and worse in others to I have signed up to look worse as an investment, hopefully long term.
Yeah.
I remember looking better from 170-ish, 174, 125, somewhere in there, all the way up to 195 when I very first bulked. And then every other time after that, I looked worse, except for a few contest preps initially where I was being more conservative. Actually, we're talking like basically my 07 prep, the initial weight gain for like 3 weeks, I looked better because I had just over dieted myself and I'd only been training for 3 years. And then 2011, where I kind of did a reverse diet, I looked I don't know if I look better. Like, I wouldn't have placed as well on a bodybuilding stage, but I personally was like, oh, I'm looking fuller and I'm still lean enough to tell.
Mhm.
Every other time I've bulked in the last 13 years, 12 years, excuse me, I have gotten worse in the way I've visually appeared. Sometimes you look better in a shirt, you know, but that's about it,
Yeah.
you know, and that's when you're doing everything right as a drug-free athlete.
No, I think it's important at that point. Like, look at performance is kind of
Yes.
the proxy for success there. Because sometimes, like, as an advanced bodybuilder, you won't really know for sure if you are better until you get shredded again, and then it can be very apparent. But it's not. I mean, that on the enhanced side, it's obviously different. But
Yes.
yeah, so that's why it's important to enjoy the process of it, because it can be discouraging if you're waiting for visual improvements.
Yep.
With a 3-year off season, you know.
Yeah, you kind of have to compare cut to cut rather than bulk to bulk in many ways.
Yeah, agreed.
Okay, so there is no good ratio because you don't even know it anyways. The answer.
Yeah, it's so individual,
Yeah.
and you can't really accurately measure it.
Yeah.
So yeah.